And now, The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the best of The Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Monday, February 16th, President's Day. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Today we're sharing with you some of our recent stories highlighting important research on federal management issues. We'll hear from Sean Moulton of the Project on Government Oversight on the important connection between census data and funding for federal programs. And Joel Gurin from the Center for Open Data Enterprise will share his findings on disappearing health data. Those stories and much more ahead during this special President's Day edition of the Best of the Federal Drive. But first, winter weather forecasting and tax season remind us how much we rely on federal workers. Elaine Kmark of Brookings joined me to explain what happens when staffing cuts push government past its breaking point and why the drive for efficiency can create systemic risk. Elaine, it's lovely to see you.
Thanks for having me.
You have written a paper that asks a very provocative question. How many people can the federal government lose before it crashes? What'd you find?
Well, we found that in the midst of all the DOGE chaos, right, people were figuring out that, wait a minute, they were making some mistakes. Some of these mistakes were absolutely clear from the get-go and were reversed in 36 to 48 hours, okay? The one that I think everybody has heard about is when they fired a couple hundred nuclear safety engineers, and these are the people who watch over our nuclear stockpiles, and not only for readiness, but to make sure there's no accidents. The stockpiles are pretty old, as people in that area will tell you. And so, the danger of something leaking, something going wrong is real, and you need people watching this all the time. And you can't just immediately turn around and go to the help wanted ads and find a nuclear safety engineer. They just, they just aren't a dime a dozen on the streets. So that created a huge outcry, and it was about 36 hours before they were rehired. And of course, the thing that happened there was that they had cut off all of their emails and contacts, so they had to really scramble to rehire these people. Now, that's a very dramatic example, but there's other ones where we are waiting to see what these cuts have done. And the fact that there's what we did when we put together this paper was we started watching carefully news sources like your own, like Government Executive, etc., that really cover the federal government. And, of course, the traditional news sources, and looking for stories that talked about rehiring civil servants who were either fired or who were offered the deferred resignation. And in a lot of these cases, the agency took back the offer of the deferred resignation. Okay, so in other words, what was happening during the whole of this year was firings, dramatic firings sometimes, reductions in force, whatever, and then pullbacks as people began to realize, particularly the political appointees, I think, in the agencies, because they knew they were on the line, right? It's no accident that the Transportation Secretary, Secretary Duffy, was the first person to yell at Elon Musk in a cabinet meeting. Why? Because he knows that what they were doing to the FAA and to the air traffic controllers was going to result in trouble. There's going to be an accident. And of course, who would be the face of that trouble? It would be the Secretary of Transportation and, of course, ultimately the president. So, he stood up. He was the first one that really stood up to Musk in front of the president. And I think increasingly that's been happening in less dramatic ways. But people have been saying, wait a minute, you just cut too much.
At what point did these reductions stop being about efficiency and really start creating systemic risk?
Oh, I think they're already creating systemic risk. And that's why, you get the dramatic examples like the nuclear safety engineers. Then you have the longer term examples. So, for instance, Everything that's going on at the CDC, at the Centers for Disease Control, right, is increasing the probability of pandemics and outbreaks. So you can imagine measles outbreaks in the coming months or years. You can even imagine polio coming back because of what they've been doing, the denigration of science, etc. And suppose you or your loved one is suffering from a really serious cancer. All right, well, there's been laboratories defunded, and they know what they see what they're doing, right? So they defund them and then they put the money back, right? And they've done this with some of Harvard's laboratories recently. The problem is you interrupt research and you lose months, if not years, of research. The mice die, right? The test, you know what I mean? All that stuff that goes on in a laboratory, which is so complicated, that when you close down a laboratory, you lose time. And if you're somebody who is got a terrible cancer and is looking for a breakthrough cure, every minute counts.
I'm speaking with Elaine K. Mark. She's director of the Center for Effective Public Management at the Brookings Institution. Elaine, another one of the administration's assertions is that, AI can replace these folks, or automation will replace them, or we can contract it out. Can they? Are there some of these functions that just really require a human in a government chair to do the work?
Most of them, frankly, require a human in a government chair. AI has huge potential, right? And back 30 years ago, when we did Reinventing Government, the internet was just coming online for many people, because we were there, remember, 1993 to 1996, right? So, we didn't even, when I went into the White House in 93, we didn't even have the use of the internet. So as we went on, absolutely, the internet was able to replace people. Okay, the technology did replace people. I have no doubt that that would be the case in AI. The problem is that AI is not ready for prime time, and the Doge people did not go about this with any sort of plan for which functions would do it. So let me give you an example. I mean, 30 years ago, we really were convinced that eventually technology would help us really get a handle on Medicare and Medicaid fraud. We've always known there's a lot of fraud in there, but it's a massive payment system, and you have to have something that can sort of look through and find the patterns that are unusual. AI is going to be great for that. But did they announce that? Right? The chaotic way makes everybody suspicious that they just cut without a plan. And eventually, maybe in the next couple of years, they'll get a plan to use AI in this piece. But let's face it, you can't use AI every place.
If this administration sees the reduction in the federal workforce as a political win, at what point might they face the risk of having unintentionally weakened government capacity to deliver services? When did the people that government is supposed to serve figure this out?
Well, let me tell you something. They've already figured it out. Okay, so polling on Doge is very unpopular with the public. Most of the public thinks, in the polls we have so far this year, they're all the same, which was by about a 10-point margin. People think the government has gone too far. They think the cuts have gone too far. Now, when they will really feel it is when, and they are, if you're a senior, you're feeling it right now, or God forbid you're turning 67 years old this year, and you're trying to sign up for your Social Security benefits. You have 3-hour wait times on the telephone. You have offices closing, even though Social Security keeps denying that they're closing offices, and then GSA puts on their site that they're doing, reductions in office space. I mean, so you've got two different agencies saying two different things. People are already feeling it on the service end. We had a little bit of a show of this in Texas with those terrible floods at the 4th of July, when you not only had NOAA asleep at the switch, but you had FEMA asleep at the switch. So there's a lot of ways that this is going to go wrong. And I think the public is already understanding that the cuts have gone too far.
Elaine Kmark is director of the Center for Effective Public Management at the Brookings Institution. Elaine, thank you so much for your insights.
Thanks, Terry. Thanks for having me.
You can find this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, resilient supply chains start with knowing what really matters and what doesn't. You're listening to the Best of the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Best of the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. A new Brookings report warns that U.S. readiness hinges on a sharper definition of the national security industrial base. Michael O'Hanlon joined me to explain why, without clear criteria, policymakers risk misallocating resources and leaving critical sectors exposed. Mr. O'Hanlon, it's great to have you on the show.
Nice to be with you. Thanks.
The industrial base and supply chains are getting a lot of attention these days, whether it's from tariffs or recovery still from the pandemic. You've got a recent report out that suggests we need a better definition of the national defense and national security industrial base. What do you see as the problem with the current definition?
Hi, Terry. Well, thanks for the question. And my co-authors, Marta Wosinska and Mark Muro and Tom Wright, what we wanted to do was to look at areas where the country's basic functioning and basic safety of its people could be threatened, even if the military or the military's manufacturing base per se was not. So we define national security to be something that could threaten the basic functioning of the country or its territory or large numbers of its people in a physical way, real acute danger. And so we try to make that definition broader than just defense, but also fairly tight. We didn't want everything to be labeled national security. For example, I don't think it's that important where my flat screen television is made. That's not national security. And I don't even think it's that important that we dominate every single industry, because unless being denied access to foreign goods could quickly put large numbers of Americans at acute risk, and unless there's a single potentially hostile foreign supplier that dominates, I don't think we have to use the term national security to deal with that concern. There may be other reasons to want to promote a certain industry or a certain part of our economy, but not for national security. So we're trying to broaden it, but within reason. And so that led us to a certain specific methodology.
It sounds like you might say that things both like shipbuilding and pharmaceutical manufacturing would be included there.
Yeah, those are good examples. So for shipbuilding, I don't really think that it matters that much where the United States gets its commercially traded goods from and what ships are carrying those goods and where they're built. But in the event of a prolonged conflict or even deterrence of conflict, like right now, when we're trying to build more ships than we currently own, and the size and capability and capacity of the shipbuilding base is one of the constraints on our ability to, let's say, build more attack submarines, then yes, I do think the shipbuilding manufacturing sector should be considered part of the national security industrial base. And commercial shipbuilding can sort of be your backup, your latent capability that you can transform into military shipbuilding in the event of prolonged need. And therefore, even commercial shipbuilding can be encompassed within this definition of a national security industrial base. With pharmaceuticals, it sort of all depends, in the sense that if the medications are made, we buy them from abroad and they're crucial to keeping Americans alive, let's say antibiotics, and they're made in Germany or Canada, I don't have any concern that we're going to be cut off in a crisis. But if large numbers are either made in China or depend on precursor chemicals made in China, then we could be in trouble. As my colleague Marta Wosinska, who's really an expert on this stuff, she really did the hard work for us and taught the rest of us, as well as, authoring the key part of the paper on this subject. And China indeed is the source of a lot of generic medications because it's good at making things at low cost. And actually, it produces a lot of the precursor chemicals. Often the final medications are produced in India or someplace else, but China is still potentially the bottleneck if they chose to be. And some people might say, well, would China really ever cut off medications or chemicals for medications upon which millions of American lives depend. Let's say, again, antibiotics being a good example. And I think in a war, they might. In a war, we bombed cities in World War II. In war, as the saying goes, all the rules are off. There are no rules in love and war. And if you're really pitted in an existential struggle of two countries duking it out, heaven forbid we ever have that conflict with China. But of course, here we're thinking about deterrence and being a credible way to deter the war as our goal. There's no reason to think China would supply those medications just out of the goodness of its heart. So I think that's a vulnerability, maybe not for Excedrin or aspirin or things that, are really medications of convenience. I mean, sure, they're important to keeping people comfortable, but I'm talking more about medications that keep people alive. And on those, I don't think we want too many foreign dependencies when it involves a country like China.
Your paper talks about 3 specific criteria for identifying critical supply chains. Walk us through those and how they fit together.
Well, we say that, and this builds on what you and I have been discussing, are large numbers of lives potentially at risk? Is there a dependence on foreign supply where one potentially hostile foreign supplier in particular could choose to cut off supply? And then could we react quickly and find alternatives, substitutes, or build up our own manufacturing capacity within the relevant timescale to avoid serious harm? And if you can't do that, and you do have a dependency on a potentially hostile foreign actor, and a cutoff or an interruption of the supply could lead to many thousands or even millions of Americans' lives being at risk, or the economy breaking down, or the military being non-functional, then you've got a problem. So if those 3 criteria give you sort of the wrong answer on each point, you need to take remedial action for your own manufacturing base and your alternative sources of supply right now, rather than wait for the crisis.
I'm speaking with Michael O'Hanlon. He's a senior fellow and director of research and foreign policy at the Brookings Institution. You looked at 16 critical infrastructure sectors. Which emerged as perhaps most vulnerable?
Yeah, well, the Department of Homeland Security helped us out here, and specifically the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, because they had created this framework of 16 areas of critical infrastructure, basically the same kind of criteria being used to develop that we use. Where are there large numbers of lives potentially at risk from damage to that infrastructure? Where could the economy become non-functional, or the military become non-functional, or the country be vulnerable? So we went through, and there are some areas, let me just give a couple examples. Like, for example, stadiums and gathering places. No one really cares in terms of national security if, let's say, you've got a dependence on China for huge flat screen TVs for, Washington Commanders Stadium, and then that's cut off in a crisis. Well, heaven forbid, we don't have to see as many replays of our beloved Commanders losing for a few months. I'm being a little facetious, but you see my point. The reason why that kind of a category is established is because terrorists could strike it, and a lot of lives could be quickly lost. And that's why it's critical infrastructure. But it's not the supply chain. It's not the manufacturing or the sourcing of key equipment that's going to potentially be interrupted and therefore put the nation's security at risk. But an example of where you could have that kind of a vulnerability beyond pharmaceuticals or military manufacturing that we've already discussed might be, let's say, agriculture. If you really depend on foreign suppliers for fertilizer, insecticide, pesticide, etc., and then that was cut off, you might not have people starving the next day, but within a few months, fundamental disruption could occur to crop production and here in the United States, and you could have big shortages. Now, maybe there are ways to substitute, potatoes for corn or what have you, but you need to do some detailed analysis, because if there are certain chemicals upon which we depend heavily on China's manufacturing base, and then if you can then determine that those chemicals, if cut off, the absence of them would produce a crisis in food production within months, that's pretty serious. And that's, by the way, an example where there's nuance and shades of gray, and we don't claim to have definitively answered that question in our study. We didn't have the capacity to do that with the 4 of us. But we did say there do seem to be some chemicals, especially with some insecticides, pesticides, where we have a high dependence on China. And we probably need to do some more work to see, in a hypothetical scenario, what would result if China cut off those pesticides and insecticides due to a national security crisis? How fast could we build alternative supply? How could we do crop rotation or substitution so that we didn't depend as much on those chemicals, et cetera? So that's an example of where there probably is some excessive dependency, maybe not enormous, but worth looking at.
I've been speaking with Michael O'Hanlon. He's a senior fellow and director of research and foreign policy at the Brookings Institution. He's also got a new book coming out, To Dare Mighty Things, A History of Defense Strategy. Thanks so much for joining me today and sharing this important research.
Great to be with you, Terry. Thank you.
You can find this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And still to come on the Federal Drive, an accurate census shapes how billions flow to states and cities. But first, the data that informs key health interventions is disappearing. This is the best of the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the best of the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Behind every health policy and intervention is data, but some of that data may soon be gone. A new analysis warns of cascading effects on research, programs, and health equity unless action is taken now. Joel Gurin, president and founder of the Center for Open Data Enterprise, joined me to explain what's at stake and what might be done. Joel, it's great to have you back.
Oh, thanks for having me, Terry.
CODE, your organization, has been doing some work lately looking at public health data and the absence or loss of it. Tell us what you're watching and why it's so important.
Sure. So the work that we're doing now is part of an effort being led by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which has become really concerned about the potential for some real disruptions to what you can think of as the public health data infrastructure. You know, this is the data on all kinds of things, on disease rates, on social determinants of health, on demographic variables, that's really critical to understanding health in this country and working to improve it for all Americans. And we've seen a lot of changes over the last year that are very troubling. There are attempts to make some of this data unavailable to the public. Some major research studies have been discontinued. There have been deep cuts to the federal staff that are responsible for collecting some of this data, and just cuts to research funding, for example, from the NIH overall. So it really adds up to a kind of cross-cutting risk to the infrastructure of public health data that we've relied on for decades.
Talk to us about why this data is so important, why it's the government's responsibility maybe to keep it up to speed, and whether it's a policy shift that's driving this, or is it just individual actions?
Well, from what we can tell, it's, I would say, a number of policy decisions that are all related to how the Trump administration sees the president's priorities and how they want to implement those. So it's not like we've seen a wholesale destruction of data, but we've seen a lot of kinds of targeted changes. Anything related to DEI, to diversity issues, to looking at health inequity, that's at risk. Any kinds of data related to environmental justice or climate justice, that's at risk. Data related to the health of LGBTQ people, particularly trans individuals, that's at risk. So we're seeing these kinds of policy priorities of the administration playing out in how they relate to the collection of public health data. And this data is critical because government data, number one, some of these data collections are expensive to do and only the government can afford it. And also federal data has a kind of credibility and as a kind of centralized source for information that other studies don't have. For example, the administration recently discontinued the USDA's study of food insecurity, which is critical to tracking hunger in America and is going to be especially important as SNAP benefits are cut back. There are other organizations and institutions that study hunger in America. The University of Michigan has a study, NORC has a study, but the federal study is the benchmark, and losing those benchmarks is what's troubling.
One of the recommendations, just to skip ahead, is that more states and localities and nonprofits collect this data. if the federal government is not going to. But what does that mean for trust in the data? You mentioned that, federal data is usually the gold standard. If we have to rely on a dispersed group of interested organizations to collect it, what happens both to the reliability of the data and the trust in the data?
Well, it's a great question, and it's one that we and a lot of other organizations are looking at now. One of the things that's important to remember is that a lot of what we see as federal data actually begins with the states. It's data that's collected by the states and then fed up kind of to federal agencies that then aggregate it, interpret it, and so on. So one of the questions people have now is, could we take some of that state data that already exists and collect it and aggregate it and study it in different ways if the federal government is going to kind of abdicate that role? There was some very interesting work during COVID, for example, when the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg Center for Government Excellence pulled together data from all over the country around COVID rates at a time when the CDC was not really doing that effectively, and their website really became the go-to source. So we have seen places where it's possible to pull state data together in ways that have a lot of credibility and a lot of impact. Some of the issues are, what do the states really need to make that data collection effective? So regardless of what the federal government does with their data, they need mandates from the federal government to collect it, or it won't be collected. They need funding. About 80% of the CDC's budget actually goes to state and local, and a lot of that is for data collection, so they need that funding stream to do the work. And they also need networks, which are starting to develop now, where they can sort of share expertise and share insights to make data work on a regional level.
I'm speaking with Joel Gurin. He's the president and founder of the Center for Open Data Enterprise. Well, Joel, then let's back up a little bit and talk about the roundtable and the research that led into this paper. How did you do it, and what were the key insights?
Sure. So one of the things that our organization, Center for Open Data Enterprise, or CODE, does is we hold roundtables with experts who have different kinds of perspectives on data. And that's what we did here with Robert Wood Johnson Foundation support. We pulled together a group of almost 80 experts in Washington last summer, and we led them through a very kind of highly facilitated, orchestrated set of breakout discussions. We also did a survey in advance. We did some individual interviews with people. We did a lot of our own desk research. The result is a paper that we've just recently published on the future of ensuring the future of essential health data for all Americans. You can find it on our website, odenterprise.org. That's odenterprise.org. If you go to our publications page and do the health section in the drop-down from publications, you'll find it right there, along with a lot of other op-eds and things that we've published related to it. Putting out this paper was really the result of pulling together a lot of information from literally hundreds of pages of notes from those breakout discussions, as well as our own research and as well as tracking everything that we could see in the news. But one of the things that I want to really emphasize, in addition to the analysis that we've done of what's happening and what some of the solutions could be, which is it's a fairly lengthy paper and hopefully useful, we've also put together an online resource hub of what we think are the 70 or so most important public health data sets. And I want to really stress this because we think it's actually a model for how to look at some of the issues affecting federal data in a lot of areas. We found that by working with these 80 or so experts and doing additional research and surveying them and talking to them, there's a lot of kind of commonality and common agreement on what are the kinds of data that are really, really critical to public health and what are those sources. Once you know that, it becomes possible for advocates to argue for why we need to keep this data and how it needs to be applied. And it's also possible to ask questions like, for this particular kind of data, could somebody other than the federal government collect it? And could we develop supplemental or even alternative sources? So we really feel that that kind of analysis, we hope, is a step forward in really figuring out how to address these issues in a practical way.
I've been speaking with Joel Gurin. He's the president and founder of the Center for Open Data Enterprise. Joel, thanks so much for elevating the importance of this critical issue.
Thank you so much.
You can find this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, an accurate census shapes how billions flow to states and cities. You're listening to the best of the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Wisdom served daily. Experience the difference of the journalists at Federal News Network.
Welcome back to the Best of the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The census is more than just a head count. It's the foundation for funding schools, clinics, and roads. A new report shows why accuracy matters more than ever. Sean Moulton from the Project on Government Oversight joined me with the details. Sean, it's great to have you on the show.
I really appreciate you having me.
You have done some recent research that connects in very detailed ways the accuracy of census data to federal funding programs. Walk us through the high points and what's at stake now as we look to 2030.
Sure. I mean, everyone knows that every 10 years we do a full census of the entire population here in the United States. And we've done it really since the founding of the country. But it's not just an academic exercise just to figure out, how many people are in each state or anything like that. We use that data in a very robust way. And one of those ways is helping to guide our federal funding. And what we've been looking into is how much funding are we talking about that gets guided by the census? And what we found is 371 federal assistance programs that we can connect to census data in terms of guidance. And it gets guided in a number of ways. There's some very simple ways where the census data can be, say, an on-off switch. The easiest example of this is funds maybe going to a rural area or funds for an urban area. Urban-rural designation is entirely based on the number of people you have. If you don't have many people, population density is low, then you're rural. That's all there is to it. And so that census data, getting that accurate, can turn on or off money going to those types of areas. Then there's formulas where different pieces of census data go into an exact formula that figures out how much your area, your state, your county, your city, something like that might get. And so again, if you get the census data wrong, it could impact how much money's coming to your area. A third area is a little bit more nebulous, but it's definitely something that can track. Some programs accept applications, and they can score and evaluate those applications on a variety of criteria, but they're always transparent about it. And sometimes census data can come into play. Maybe the program is really geared and they want to help lower income areas or areas with historically disadvantaged communities. And so census data can be used to determine that. And your application might get extra points. And then the last way is for some of our loan programs, census data can even influence the interest rate that you might have to pay back. And so it can affect how much money gets out and then how much money you have to pay back. And these 371 programs, they accounted for $2.2 trillion in a single fiscal year, just 1 year.
Was there anything about the 2020 census or recent funding formulas that raised flags for you that you want to make sure get addressed before we get to 2030?
Sure. Every census problems happen. I mean, it's a huge endeavor trying to count everyone in the country sort of at the same time, exactly where they are. And so we always have errors, but 2020 was one of the first years we did a lot more digital records. We were using what's called administrative records to try and fill in some gaps from non-responses. And so we really need to address those. There are also a number of states that had statistically significant undercounts or overcounts. And those are particularly troubling. And we need states and locations, especially in the areas that had previous undercounts, to make more of an effort in the run-up to 2030 to make sure they get the count right.
I'm speaking with Sean Moulton. He's a senior policy analyst at the Project on Government Oversight. Let's dig into those undercounts a little bit. Are there communities that are most vulnerable to being undercounted? And when they are undercounted, what is the impact?
So there are, and Census Bureau knows this and has made efforts over the years to do better outreach to these what they call hard to count communities. or historically hard to count communities. And these are communities, lower income communities because of the digital divide. These are rural communities. These are renters. Children are hard to count. For some reason, even though the parents are filling out the forms, they might not include their children for some reason. I mean, maybe they don't understand it applies to everybody. Non-English speakers, not primary English speakers. Sometimes they don't understand the forms. They don't understand the necessity to respond. So there's a lot of different groups that are harder than the average citizen will say to get those responses back from. And so, again, this is where states and cities and counties can do a better job of reaching out and making sure their community members know the importance of the census, not just as again, legal activity, but as something that helps the community and then responds.
The census is supposed to count every single person, right? Citizens
Correct.
And non-citizens. We had the addition of a citizenship question in 2020. Certainly, we've had a lot of focus under the Trump administration on citizenship. What impact do you think that's going to have leading into the 2030 count?
Well, so in 2020, we had an attempt to add a citizenship question, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they tossed it out on a procedural issue. They said, it's a question you can ask. It's been in the census before, but they did it in the wrong way. Their process was wrong, flawed. So we may be seeing another fight over that. The real problem is the citizenship question. There's not much evidence that it's going to give us anything of importance. And more importantly, a lot of what we use the census for, it doesn't matter if you're a citizen. I mean, the funding for hospitals, or healthcare or roads. The roads don't care if you're a citizen and driving on them or if you're a non-citizen and driving on them. And we need to repair the roads based on the wear and tear and how many people are there. And the same for mass transit and other things. We're funding for everyone. And so if we try and narrow our ask to citizens, we're going to get our allocations of funds wrong. And citizens will then be also penalized. That they'll have roads that aren't being repaired fast enough, and they'll have problems, getting into emergency rooms and what have you. So even though the funding has kind of fix that a little, and citizens will also be affected because they will encounter the problems that the low funding leads to. Poor maintenance on the roads, longer wait times for their health care. And so even though they may think, this is about citizens, non-citizens, everyone's affected when the funding gets impacted.
Do you have a sense that members of Congress understand this connection? I mean, at the core, one of their jobs is to bring home money to their districts. If the census count is accurate, the better their funding will be. And yet, do you think they really understand the importance of the accuracy here?
I don't. It is pretty buried. We had to do a lot of research to figure out the extent of this. And I can tell you that just a few years ago, the Census Bureau used to do a report somewhat along these lines, and their number was much, much lower. It's only been in recent years that we've kind of expanded our understanding to realize just how important the Census Bureau numbers are in terms of guiding federal funds.
I've been speaking with Sean Moulton. He's a senior policy analyst at the Project on Government Oversight. Sean, thank you so much for this fascinating deep dive into the census.
Thank you for having me.
You can find this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editors are Daisy Thornton and Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Up next, the top national headlines from CBS News and the Federal Newscast. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.